Marcus Ellison sat behind the wheel of his truck in the parking lot of the Fellowship Hall on Grand River, engine off, hands still resting at 10 and 2 like the plant taught him decades ago. Through the windshield he could see the string lights already glowing inside, could hear the bass line leaking out into the July evening, and still he did not move. At 58, retirement had softened nothing about him. His shoulders still filled a room the way they had filled a supervisor's office for 31 years, and his voice still carried the flat, unhurried weight of a man who expected to be heard the first time. Tonight, in a suit that felt one size too formal for a body built for coveralls, he looked less like a father giving a toast and more like a man bracing for an inspection. In the breast pocket of that suit jacket sat a photograph he had carried, folded twice, since before Malcolm was born. It showed 3 boys on a corner in 1991, laughing hard enough to blur, one of them wearing Marcus's own face at 17. He was supposed to be inside already, glass in hand, 3 sentences of something warm and easy for his son's rehearsal dinner. Instead he sat with the photograph between 2 fingers, turning it over the way some men turn over a coin before a decision they have already made in private. Something Malcolm had said at Thanksgiving 8 months back had lodged itself sideways in his chest and never worked its way loose, and Marcus suspected that whatever he said tonight would either dig it out or bury it deeper. He had not decided which he was more afraid of. Detroit in the fall of 1988 wore its wounds close to the surface, block after block of houses, with plywood in the windows, where families had followed the last shift out of town. On Lynwood Street, where the Ellisons rented the upstairs of a 2-family flat, the streetlights came on before the porch lights did, and everyone under 18 knew what that meant. Otis Ellison, Marcus's father, had worked the stamping line at a plant off Mound Road for 19 years, the kind of job that used to buy a house and a used Buick and still leave something for church on Sunday. By 88, the layoff notices had thinned his crew down to a rumor of itself, and Otis came home most nights saying less than he had the night before. There was a particular silence Otis carried after those shifts, one Marcus learned to read the way other boys read weather. His father never explained it and never cried in front of him, and Marcus absorbed the lesson without a single word being spoken. A man's trouble was a man's alone to carry. At 15, Marcus moved through the neighborhood the way most boys his age did, catching a version of himself in the reflection of the corner store's window and adjusting it slightly, the walk a shade slower, the jaw set a shade harder. It cost him nothing to sound like where he was from, and on that corner, sounding like anything else could cost a great deal more. On the corner, everyone quickly learned to read a hierarchy invisible to outsiders. Who could be joked with, who couldn't, who had the standing to end an argument with a look instead of a fist. Psychologists would later put a name to what Marcus and boys like him performed every day just to move safely through the neighborhood. Cool pose, a studied calm that borrowed confidence from posture when nothing else in the world was offering any. His mother's brother, Cornell Vaughn, had come up on those same blocks a decade earlier, and had buried 2 friends before he turned 25. Cornell was the one who finally sat Marcus down, not long after Marcus came home one evening with a split lip and an empty jacket where his new coat used to be. 3 boys from 2 streets over had circled him outside Mr. Dabney's store, and by the time it was finished Marcus had lost the coat, some blood from his lip, and a piece of the ease he'd walked around with before. He told no one but Cornell, and only because Cornell was the one who found him sitting on the curb afterward, not crying, just very still. Cornell didn't console him so much as recruit him. He taught Marcus how to hold his face flat when his stomach was in knots, how to drop his voice half an octave, and let the silence between his words do the threatening for him, until the posture became less a performance and more a second skeleton holding the first one up. There was real belonging in it, too, and Marcus would spend the next 4 decades refusing to pretend otherwise. On the corner with Terrell, Boo, Sims, and two other boys from the block, he found a brotherhood that asked nothing of him but loyalty. And for a fatherless stretch of afternoons when Otis worked doubles, that brotherhood was the closest thing to family he had outside his own house. What none of them said out loud was how much of it was armor. Underneath the flat face and the unhurried voice, Marcus was still the same boy who flinched at raised voices and lay awake some nights listening for his father's key in the door. Only now nobody could tell that from looking at him, which was exactly the point. At Central High, the same posture that protected him on Lynwood earned him a seat in the slower classes before a teacher had heard him complete a full sentence. Two different counselors in 2 different years looked at the way he carried himself and decided, without asking, what kind of future he was suited for. His mother, Ruth, fought that decision the only way she knew how, coaching him at the kitchen table to switch his voice like a man changing a shirt, one register for Lynwood Street, a cleaner one for anywhere a white face might be doing the judging. She called it talking right, and she meant it as protection, the same way Cornell meant the posture as protection, and Marcus absorbed both lessons as if they were one continuous language. Church on Sunday ran on a different set of rules than the corner did on Friday night, and Marcus learned early that a man was expected to carry his trouble in silence in both places, just dressed differently. Ruth prayed over the things she couldn't fix and told her son that God tested men by what they kept quiet about a lesson that braided itself so tightly into Cornell's lesson, about a flat face that Marcus, by 16, could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. By 16, he was fluent in the switch, sliding between the two versions of himself so smoothly that neither his teachers nor his boys on the corner ever caught the seam. It would take him another 30 years to understand what that constant translation had quietly cost him. The spring he turned 17, 2 officers stopped him and Boo 3 blocks from home for the crime of standing near a car that wasn't stolen. Marcus remembered going still in a way he recognized even then, the same flat face Cornell had taught him, hands where they could be seen, voice emptied of anything that could be mistaken for defiance. When he told his father that night, Otis didn't rage and didn't comfort him, just gripped his shoulder hard enough to bruise and said the words would follow Marcus for the rest of his life. Never let them see it move you, not one muscle, not once. It was protection dressed as coldness, and Marcus couldn't yet tell the difference between the two. The neighborhood kept tightening around them through those years, crack moving through Lynwood the way the layoffs had moved through the plant, hollowing things out from the inside while the outside still looked mostly the same. Boo started running errands for an older cousin nobody asked too many questions about, and the money in his pocket bought him a confidence Marcus half envied and mostly worried over. 2 doors down, Boo's own older brother went away on a 10-year federal sentence. The same spring, the harsher drug sentencing laws of that era finally caught up with half the young men on Lynwood, and the block absorbed his absence the way it absorbed everything else quietly, without much conversation about what it meant. Mass incarceration wasn't a phrase anyone on that corner used out loud, but its shape was as familiar to Marcus as the shape of his own father's silence. Marcus chose a different door when it opened for him at 18, an apprenticeship on the line at Otis's old plant, trading the corner's version of respect for the kind you earned with a perfect attendance card and a supervisor's nod. He worked the way his father had worked, doubles when they were offered, silence when the work wore on him, and told himself the tiredness was proof he was becoming a man worth something. Boo didn't get the chance to choose a different door. 2 years later, he was shot outside a party on Fenkel over a debt that had nothing to do with him directly, and Marcus heard about it standing in his mother's kitchen with his work boots still on. At the funeral, Marcus stood dry-eyed between Cornell and his father, the 3 of them a study in the same learned stillness, and shook every hand that offered condolences without letting his own hand shake back. He grieved Boo the only way he had been taught to grieve anything, by working through it, and within a week he had picked up an extra shift rather than sit still with what he was feeling. Somewhere in that stretch of grief, he never spoke aloud. Marcus made himself a promise without ever framing it as one. He would build something solid enough that nothing could hollow it out from underneath him, the way the plant had hollowed out his father. And nobody standing near him would ever end up on a curb the way Boo had. He decided, quietly, that his love would look like provision, because he had no evidence yet that it could look like anything softer and survive. He met Gloria Patterson 2 summers later at a cousin's cookout, drawn first to how unbothered she seemed by his silences, the way she filled the space around his quiet without demanding he fill it himself. She told her sister that night that Marcus Ellison looked like a man who had already decided how his whole life would go, and she wasn't entirely wrong. What Gloria read as steadiness in those early months was, more precisely, a well-practiced absence, a way of being present in a room without ever fully arriving in it. It would be years before she learned to name the difference, and by then she had already built a marriage around loving a man who showed up for everything, except the conversations that mattered most. They married in 1993, and Denise came the following spring with Malcolm 2 years behind her, and Marcus threw himself into providing with the same discipline he'd once thrown into surviving a corner. Overtime became his love language before he ever had a name for the phrase, time on the line trading itself directly for a roof, for shoes, for a Buick nicer than the one his father drove. When something in the house broke, Marcus fixed it before anyone finished asking. When Denise needed braces or Malcolm needed cleats, the money appeared without a conversation, because to Marcus a need spoken aloud and then met without complaint was its own kind of "I love you," even if he never once used those words to say it. Malcolm was 7 the first time he watched his father repair the water heater alone at 11 at night, rather than wake anyone for help, moving through the task in that same flat, unhurried silence Otis had once carried home from the plant. Some inheritances passed down in a will, and some passed down simply by a boy watching his father work. The overtime years stretched into decades, and Marcus climbed from the line to a lead position to a shift supervisor's badge, each promotion bought with a body that quietly kept the tab. He wore exhaustion like a badge of honor because collapsing from effort felt, to him, like a cleaner kind of defeat than admitting he needed anything at all. There's a name for the particular kind of striving Marcus practiced for 3 decades, a psychological concept called John Henryism, the belief that enough effort and enough silence could outwork any obstacle a black man in Detroit might face. Nobody warned him it was possible to win that fight against the plant floor and lose it anyway, one unmonitored blood pressure reading at a time. 2 years before his son's wedding, that tab came due on the plant floor, a crushing tightness across his chest that dropped him to one knee in front of half his crew. He drove himself to urgent care rather than call an ambulance, because some part of him still measured manhood by how little help a situation required. In the hospital, Gloria's hands shook holding his, and for the first time in 30 years, Marcus watched fear move across her face without immediately trying to fix it. He told the doctor he was fine before the doctor had finished the sentence, and told Gloria the same thing 3 separate times, as if repetition might make it truer. Malcolm drove up from Ann Arbor that same night and sat in the waiting room until morning, and a week later, once his father was home and back to insisting he was fine, Malcolm brought up family therapy for the first time. He said it carefully, the way a man tests ice, telling his father that maybe it wasn't weak to talk to somebody about what almost happened. Marcus heard it as an accusation dressed as concern, and something in him closed the way it had closed on the corner outside Mr. Dabney's store 40 years earlier. "We don't do that," he told his son, in the flat voice Cornell had built for him, and the conversation ended before it had properly started. The months after that scare put a distance between father and son that neither of them named directly, phone calls shortening, visits growing more occasional, both men circling a subject neither would touch first. Gloria watched it happen from the middle, loving them both and unable to translate one man's silence into a language the other could hear. At Thanksgiving, with the whole family around the table, Malcolm finally said the thing he'd been sitting on, quiet enough that only Marcus fully caught it. "You still talk like you're back on Lynwood, Pop, like the man who raised me never left that corner." He didn't say it cruelly, only tired, but it landed in Marcus like a diagnosis he wasn't ready to receive. Marcus said nothing back, excused himself to check on nothing in particular in the garage, and stood alone among his tools until the sting in his chest had nothing left to do with his heart. He would carry that sentence, unanswered, for the 8 months between that dinner and the rehearsal dinner he now sat outside of. Malcolm had built a different kind of adulthood than his father's, an engineering degree from Michigan, a condo in Ferndale, a fiancée named Aisha who asked him direct questions and expected direct answers. He had started seeing a therapist 2 years before his father's chest pains, not in crisis, but out of a quieter suspicion that something inherited was steering him without his full consent. In session, Malcolm learned words for patterns he recognized immediately in himself: the compulsion to fix rather than feel, the discomfort that crept in whenever someone offered him help, the way he, too, disappeared into work whenever a conversation threatened to get too honest. Naming the pattern didn't dissolve it. He still caught himself, most weeks, choosing a deadline over a difficult phone call. Therapists have a term for what Malcolm was circling in those sessions: masculine role strain. The exhausting gap between the man he'd been raised to perform and the man he actually felt like underneath it, and another for the way he chose distance over vulnerability with people who loved him, an attachment pattern inherited as surely as his father's jawline. Recognizing the shape of it in himself didn't make the shape disappear, but it did mean he could finally point to it instead of just living inside it. What Malcolm had, that his father never got the chance to have, was language for the thing and a generation around him less ashamed to use it. He wasn't healed so much as aware, which was its own kind of progress, the kind that looks unglamorous from the outside and feels enormous from within. Aisha had watched Malcolm work through more than one sleepless night, trying to write a father-son toast that didn't sound like an accusation, tearing up drafts that came out either too soft to be honest or too honest to be kind. She told him, the morning of the rehearsal dinner, that whatever happened tonight, he had already done the harder work simply by deciding to speak at all. Inside the hall now, Malcolm kept checking the door every few minutes between handshakes, half expecting his father not to come at all. Nobody in that room could have said with certainty whether Marcus Ellison would walk through it, retreat to the truck's silence one more time, or find, somewhere in himself, a third option neither of them had tried before. Back in the parking lot, Marcus still hadn't moved, the engine long cold, the photograph now flattened open across his knee instead of folded shut in his palm. Through the window he could make out Malcolm's shape near the entrance, checking the door again, and something in the sight of it finally cracked something loose in Marcus's chest. He looked down at the 3 boys frozen mid-laugh in 1991. Himself, Boo, and Cornell's nephew Ray, none of them yet old enough to know which of them would make it to 40. Boo's arm was slung around Marcus's shoulder in the photograph, exactly the way it had been slung 100 ordinary afternoons before the one that mattered. The promise Marcus had made himself at Boo's funeral rose up in him again, whole and unspoken after 36 years. Build something nothing could hollow out. Let no one near him end up on a curb the way Boo had. He understood now, sitting outside his son's rehearsal dinner, that he had kept half that promise and broken the other half without ever meaning to. A knock came at the passenger window, gentle, and Gloria's face appeared in the glass, still in her dress from earlier, arms crossed against the July evening. She didn't ask if he was ready. She simply opened the door and lowered herself into the seat beside him the way she had done through 31 years of a marriage built mostly on her patience. "You planning on giving that toast from out here?" she asked, not unkindly, and let the question sit in the cab between them instead of chasing it with anything softer. It was the kind of simple question that a lesser woman might not have known was actually the hardest one in the room. Marcus turned the photograph over once more before he answered her. "I don't know how to say what I mean in there without sounding like I'm apologizing for the only man I know how to be," he said, and the honesty of it surprised him more than it surprised her. Gloria didn't reach for his hand and didn't offer him a solution. She simply sat beside him in the quiet the way Cornell once had, letting the silence hold its shape a moment longer before either of them broke it. Sometimes the whole of loving a man like Marcus Ellison had been exactly this, she thought, learning to sit inside his silence instead of trying to talk him out of it. When Marcus finally spoke again, he told her about the day outside Mr. Dabney's store, the coat, the blood, Cornell's flat voice teaching him how to disappear behind his own face. He told her, for the first time in 31 years of marriage, exactly what it had cost him to build that particular armor, and what it had cost Boo not to get the chance to take his off. "The tough talk was never a costume I put on for style," he told her. "It was the only language Lynwood Street left me to survive in, and somewhere along the way I forgot how to set it down even when the danger was gone." Gloria listened without interrupting, and for the first time all evening, Marcus felt the sentence land somewhere other than back on his own chest. They walked into the hall together a few minutes later, Marcus's hand resting lightly at the small of her back, and Malcolm met them just inside the door with a look that asked the question he'd been too afraid to ask outright all night. "You good, Pop?" he said, and it wasn't really a question at all so much as an offering. Marcus didn't answer him there in the doorway. He waited until the room had quieted for the toasts, glass raised, photograph still folded in his breast pocket like a second heart. "I built a lot of things to keep this family safe," he said, his voice thick in a way it had never once been in public. "But I never learned how to build the kind of safe where I let you see me scared, and that's on me." "Not on you." The room went still around them, and Malcolm, glassy-eyed, said only 4 words back, "I heard you, Pop," which was not a resolution so much as a receipt, proof the sentence had finally traveled the whole distance between them. It was not the speech either of them had rehearsed, and it was the only one either of them would remember. What followed was not dramatic. Marcus crossed the small distance between them and pulled his son into an embrace that lasted a beat longer than either of their bodies knew what to do with. Arms wrapped all the way around instead of the quick shoulder clasp they'd traded for 30 years. Later that night, instead of tucking the photograph back into his breast pocket the way he had for 3 decades, Marcus set it on the table between himself and Malcolm and left it there, face up, for anyone to see. It was a small thing, the kind of thing no one else in the room would have noticed, and it was the first time in his adult life he had let that picture sit anywhere but hidden against his own chest. On the drive home that night, windows down, Detroit rolling by in the particular blue-black of a July midnight, Marcus didn't reach for the radio the way he usually did to fill the quiet between himself and Gloria. He let the silence stay a silence instead of turning it into a wall, and found, for the first time in a long while, that it didn't feel like something he had to survive. Somewhere back on a corner that no longer existed the way he remembered it, a boy had once learned to trade his softness for safety, and had carried that trade so faithfully for 40 years that he'd nearly forgotten it was ever a choice at all. What Marcus Ellison finally understood riding home beside his wife, with his son's 4 words still warm in his chest, was that the same tongue that had once kept a boy alive on Lynwood Street could, if he let it, still learn a second language now, not instead of the first but alongside it.